Brought to you by bedroombattlefields.com, this is the Tabletop Miniature Hobby Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Tabletop Miniature Hobby Podcast, episode 150. It's time for a reroll of a classic conversation with Gav Thorpe. This was originally published in the heady days of July 2023, and I thought it was about time to have a wee listen back to it. So here's Gav himself. I kicked things off by asking him why he thinks this hobby still exists.
Because it's not just one hobby. For a start, there's lots of aspects to it. So there's the reading and the, whether that's like history or novels or for, like fictional backgrounds. There's the craft side of it, the social side of it, the actual gaming side. So it's got lots of appeal in different ways. So, but I think the main thing is it mostly revolves around a very tactile, physical experience. That you can do either with other people or quite a bit of the time actually on your own. I think a lot of hobbies are actually for people to enjoy by themselves in many ways, whether it's collecting things or making things and stuff. Is to is to fill your time. And there's gaming has got that in spades really. There's for most of us, the amount of time spent between playing actual games and either reading about stuff or prepping for games or buying things, painting things, all of that kind of stuff makes up a far more bulk of the hobby, even though we call it gaming for the most part, actually. That's probably, about 10% of it for most people, if they're lucky. And some people obviously get to do that a lot more. They go to events every weekend or have a regular club and things. And I think the things that it appeals to, because again, it's a very broad church, not just within the hobby, but within, sort of from historical through to fantasy and science fiction and pulp miniatures and all kinds of stuff. Again, there's lots of things for different tastes as well these days. So whatever your preferred, I suppose genre is not quite the word, but whatever you're interested in, actually there's quite a route in, if you're of a mind to be like collecting toy soldiers or playing games, and there's a route into it, whether you're into your military history or if you're just into the Lord of the Rings or you just like the look of a space marine. So it's actually quite accessible. Certainly over the last 30 years it's become a lot more accessible as well. I think that's one of the things. Is it was very niche. So like when I was, getting a young teenager getting into it, it was definitely collecting toy soldiers and things was kind of almost on the level of still like stamp collecting, coin collecting, that kind of hobby. Whereas actually, as culture has got more games and genre orientated and more mainstream, it's one of those hobbies that's been able to expand with it, I think, because it plugs into a lot of that. Like I say, it's one of those things that sort of can exploit, the kind of like the surge in interest in sci-fi and fantasy and all that kind of stuff. Whereas of other more traditional hobbies perhaps don't do that, as much as they try to, say, oh, cool, here's some cool 140,000 stamps for your collection, or whatever it might be. It's, there's only so much you can do. Whereas actually, gaming continues to expand, I think, and change, and that's what and adapt. So it's always kept it. It's always felt relevant. It's always been, once you're into it as well. It's one of those things that people seem to come back to. There seems to be a fairly common journey of sort of maybe discovering gaming in your teens, maybe falling out for it for a few years. In your later teens, early 20s, then maybe rediscovering it either, when you finish university or when you have your own kids or stuff like that, and it's still there for you. And then you find out that although everything's changed, everything's still the same as well. Those basics of like buying miniatures, painting miniatures, playing games haven't changed really. And there's a lot more in common across all of those things than there are differences, even though it looks potentially at times that there's so many different things. The basic drivers of collecting, painting, playing are still there. Whether you want to collect a Roman legion in 6mm or the latest Space Marine releases, those drivers are still the same thing of recreating those stories, recreating those battles for yourself. So yeah, it's always feels relevant, I suppose. is one of those things that as a hobby, and that's why it's managed to kind of keep going.
Yeah, I mean, from just going slightly off script for a second, from the sidelines, I suppose, when video games started to take off, those on the sidelines might have looked at what we were doing and thought, well, there'll be no need for that soon because this could be recreated digitally. But that's ignoring all the other things that you've talked about, the collecting, the painting, the tactile stuff. It was just looking at it from a purely let's have a game of something point of view. So I suppose that's a big reason why video games haven't killed this hobby.
No, they haven't. And video games actually have fed it in many ways. And again, particularly because because we spend so much more time with video games, actually having a physical hobby has its own appeal of being able to switch off the screen and do something that's just right in front of us. But also, I mean, again, with a sample size of one, my son, but it's like lots of things that I discovered through gaming, particularly like lots of elements of science fiction and fantasy and things like that, are now just kind of common parlance. They're in kids' cartoons. They're in, just like in video games. So like the idea of space warriors, fighting, weird aliens and or knights and Romans and all this other kind of other stuff is kind of shifted out of books and into videos and video games and things anyway. And particularly when you look at lots of as gaming itself has expanded into very casual gaming, through video games, through tablets and phones and stuff like that. So as that's expanded, the niche for miniatures gaming and tabletop gaming has just kind of expanded with it within that overall gaming umbrella. So more people, even though they don't necessarily identify as gamers, will have a game on their phone. They will have, they'll at least be aware of the hobby in a way that they just weren't 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So as the net broadens, it catches more fish. That's just the nature of it. So, and people are more prepped for the ideas behind gaming and even just simple things like, video games have also borrowed stuff from the hobby in terms of customization of your characters and the representations of yourself in those games in terms of skins and being able to. So again, particularly in kids' games like Minecraft and Roblox, the idea that you can create an avatar of yourself that actually you have the ability to have control over what things look like. Which again, the thing about tabletop games more than any other game is they're interactive, that you can choose what you do with them. Now you can sort of go in and people do mods for video games and stuff like that, but actually obviously that's a whole expertise in itself. And although there are certain toolkits and things, and some games now are designed around modding and things like that, they're not necessarily the actual hobby. That's taking it a step further. Whereas actually you get to choose what color your Space Marines are, you get to choose what you collect, you have an interaction with it, you can make up stories about those characters and define them in a way that you just can't with a video game. So there's still a different experience there, an element of control that no amount of technology really allows you to do. And the video games are trying to emulate in certain ways by giving you back some of that control over what you do with their games. It's not just delivered to you, you're actually having an interaction with it. And that's what a hobby is. That's one of the things that defines a hobby rather than just like I suppose Rick Priestley had quite an interesting take on this back in the day, which was like the difference between a hobby and a pastime, which was a hobby which actually required dedication, time and money to do. That you actually get out of it what you put in. So, and so again, that's sort of one of those differences between just like, playing a match 3 game on your phone in a casual style just to fill some time, or going out and paying 40 quid for an Xbox game and playing it for 60 hours. So, there's a difference there in terms of your relationship to it and what you put into it. So, yeah. And I think that is one of those things is, it continues to, those things haven't changed. Those needs that we have, or for certain people, what we used to call the hobby gene at Games Workshop, who have that desire to collect, to paint, to do whatever of those many things it offers. It's the same as it was, like 35 years ago when I was, just starting out playing.
What's your favourite book of all time?
I'm really bad at favourites. I don't do favourites very well because they just change all the time, and it depends what mood I'm in and things like that. So I was thinking about this a little bit, and I would say I wouldn't say so favourite's slightly the wrong word, but there's a couple of books that whenever I look at them, I've still got them. They give me a very visceral reaction, and they are about when I got into the hobby, when I got into sort of like things. One of them is the Rogue Trader 140,000 rulebook. I can literally open those pages and it's a time machine for me. And I look at those pictures and things, and I can remember how exciting and how amazing this thing seemed to me when I was 14 when it came out. So, there's that, and I have a quite similar experience to my basic and expert edition Dungeons and Dragons sets, because again, they were a little bit, I was a little bit younger, I was born 10, 11, I think, when we got those. But there's just seeing these pictures and thinking that this is something I can participate in, going back to what I was just, saying about the hobby and participation. So yeah, so I suppose, and that's nice. It's like that connection with those books is still nice, which I don't get from many other media, really. There's certain things, again, I suppose it's also partly because I've still got those actual original books. It's not, so like my version of Lord of the Rings, for instance, isn't the one that I read when I was growing up. It's, because that was my dad's copy. My versions of various other favourite books just don't quite give me, it's like I enjoy them. I might go back and reread them and things, but there isn't that, there isn't that kind of attachment to my life, I suppose, in the same way as those books have. And I've come to define so much of my life later as well. So yeah, I'll put those down as my favourite books in that sense. Yeah.
Who or what is your biggest inspiration in what you do?
I find the most inspiring thing is the fans, really, and other hobbyists and things. Actually, I find what they do, and seeing other people kind of collecting and painting and gaming, and I remember that, it's easy to kind of get detached from the end result of a thing. So like either writing a book or designing a game, and you're sat there and you're in a little bit of a bubble generally, and creating this thing, and that becomes the end of it, and forgetting there's a reader out there or there's a hobbyist out there that is going to interact with us at some point. So I find going to events, like whether that's sort of like gaming events or sort of writing events, conventions, really inspirational. I'm terrible for, because I split between games design and sort of like fiction writing. So I swing madly between the two, in terms of depending on who I've last been talking to or what I've last been reading. So I'll be reading like Tabletop Games magazine, and it's like, oh yeah, cool, and I really want to, I've really got some cool ideas for board games, and then I'll go to Fantasy Con or something like that and talking to other novelists and stuff like that. I really, really need to work on some of my own fiction, and I'll go to like a Games Workshop event and just go, oh yeah, cool, I'll remember how much I love Warhammer, so, and I feed off that, I suppose. It's not necessarily other people's enthusiasm, but there's a slightly vampiric quality to it, because I like so many things. I find it very, it's like I'm drawn in many different directions about what things I enjoyed creating and interacting with, but actually seeing other people interacting and enjoying those things kind of like acts as a bit of a lodestone for me, and helps me focus my thoughts and remind me of why I do some of these things. So, whether that's talking to people about books or the hobby or a particular set of rules even, it's like, oh yeah, that's really cool. Actually, yes, I remember now. That's why I do this. And the other thing, and I think an activity for me, I think I find I get into either like a bit of a vicious circle or like a virtuous spiral, depending on how much I'm actually gaming and seeing people. So like if I'm playing a game and I'm painting the models to play the game, and kind of they add to each other because I want to play a bit more because I've painted the models and stuff. Whereas actually if I go through a slightly furlough period of stuff, when I'm not actually getting out, chatting, and actually gaming and things, I don't necessarily just paint things in abstract, for later and stuff. I'm not very good at that. So, or again, it's one of those sort of become a bit of a trope of the hobby, really. But actually, these sort of like the paint and chat sessions with just getting a couple of friends on a video chat, and so and talking, and you might be talking about anything else, but actually chatting to other people while you're painting, making it a social thing. Again, that's what gets me going. I don't. I like creating words and things. I can sit down and do that, but actually I tend to not do much of the hobby side of the painting or collecting side necessarily, unless I've got other people around or have recent experience of being around people that kind of spur me on and remind me of like, oh yeah, cool, that's why. Yes, you do enjoy doing this. Remember, it's not a chore. It's actually something I quite enjoy, and then I get back into it again. So, yeah, the inspiration actually is generally the community. I think I get it more from outside than inside. The inside stuff is more wanting to write rules or wanting to write stories and things, whereas actually the participating in the hobby bit comes from the outside. Yeah.
What's got your attention right now in the hobby? What are you painting, playing or planning for this month? Head on over to bedroombattlefields.com/voicemail to submit a clip for our monthly hobby update episode. That link again is bedroombattlefields.com/voicemail. And now back to the show. What's your best value budget hobby purchase of less than £20?
It's a tricky one. But I have a variety of. I wouldn't necessarily pick one, but I think just getting some nice basing materials can make a real difference to a miniature. You can have you can do a nice, fairly straightforward paint job, but actually just having a nice little bush or some rocks or having just a nice basing scheme on an army can really bring it together and make it. So if I had 20 quid to spend, I spend as much time working out what my basing scheme is for miniatures as I do the colour scheme for the models themselves and things like that, and making little flock mixes and stuff, of particular different kind of mixes of flock and grains and stuff like that. For a particular war band or army and things. So, I think you can, £20 of little, maybe a bag of flock and some coloured sand or whatever, could make a huge difference. Particularly because I remember that back in the day of everything was like sand, goblin green bases when they all just looked slightly toy-like, the red period and stuff. So, my best hobby purchase is probably some little tufts of bushes that I've got and some nice static grass.
So you don't do the sort of golf course aesthetic of the mid-90s then?
No, not anymore. No, I think Necromunda broke me. That was a thing, it was. But when we had to do green bases for Necromunda, it was just like, no, okay. And
when they're in Space Hulk as well, they're in the Space Hulk and they're on the golf course, it's amazing.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Well, that's one of the things we managed to break out of slightly. I think it was like 3rd edition 40k really, where we said, you can put stuff on like. Actually, no, it's probably more about Epic, I think. And again, it was a weird they didn't do it with Necromunda, but actually, I remember when there was an Imperial Fists army for the studio. That was and they were on nice kind of sandy bases. We actually did a desert board for the first time, I think, in the studio. And then suddenly it was like the grip of Goblin Green was prized off the bases. Probably sales tanked of Goblin Green then. That's why they discontinued it. But, whereas, so, yeah, I think it is. I mean, my painting's all right, but actually just the difference between having a painted miniature where I've not done the base yet and then putting the basing on, do the rim, paint the base, and suddenly it's a finished miniature and it looks like a finished miniature, whereas actually until then it's just like a thing with loads of blobs of paint on it. It's amazing the difference it can make of just bringing everything together. So I do obsess about it slightly.
If you could live in any historical period, where, when, and why?
To be fair, I would probably just kind of go for Victorian, I think, because I could get, actually no, sorry, I'd probably go Edwardian. I think a bit later, just kind of turn the century Edwardian. It's like not terrible life chances, but also actually I could get away with. It's like the birth of pulp fiction and magazine, the into the Victorian Edwardian period is like I could get away with just like writing pulp fiction and penny dreadfuls and things like that. So it wouldn't be too different from what I do now. And also, actually, I think I'd look okay in a top hat and tails. I think I'd cut an okay figure, but I wouldn't. We're past dueling. Nobody's going to challenge me to a duel or anything. So I think. So that's and also trains. I can, you can get this transportation. You can go to places. It's slightly interesting. Yeah. I'd have to try and get over the whole kind of empire thing, but there's once you go back far enough, there's going to be something horrible happening to somebody somewhere already. So, probably I'd be okay as an Edwardian gentleman.
Do you think there are any underutilized settings or periods in tabletop gaming?
I think there's getting fewer. I was thinking about one of the interesting periods, and I'm not an expert on it in any sense, but it's something I'm sort of aware of actually, which would be because I think could be quite interesting, is sort of like the Cold War, but rather because Cold War stuff tends to focus a bit on, what if the Cold War went hot and the Russians rolled into Germany and, sort of like Team Yankee, all that kind of stuff. Whereas actually I think the fighting all the little proxy wars, either in South America or across Asia, or those kinds of things, actually could be quite interesting, sort of small guerrilla groups. And because I think, again, there's very limit. A lot more games these days are very much for people of not quite so much space and not quite so much time. That's why skirmish gaming is kind of very useful. So it's kind of like, I suppose, thinking about sort of small action stuff, which never really hit the headlines and nobody really thinks of as a war in many ways, but actually there was a lot of it sort of like going on that people didn't necessarily realize around the Balkans and that, So there's kind of like, I think you can also mix it with a little, kind of interesting narratives of kind of like a little bit of a spy game kind of thing going on as well. So, but yeah, so I'm not exactly sure, but it's one of those, like I say, I wouldn't think of immediately of anyone who's kind of really doing that at the moment. And I've done a bit of reading on it, like I say, just over the years of like revolutionaries and things like that. So I could see how you could link that into sort of like some cool campaign systems and things like that. And interesting, again, characterful miniatures, I suppose, of not just like guys in uniforms and stuff, but actually sort of like paramilitaries and things like that. So it could be quite interesting. But yeah, I mean, everything else is kind of covered. It's like you look somewhere, even down to like cavemen wars and things like that. It's like pretty much somebody's got a miniatures range and a wolf set there. Fantasies. I mean, there's obviously licenses. There's various things I'm into that would be cool. I mean, one of the great things is doing at the moment is working with Warlord on their 2000 AD licensed games. So that's been cool, bringing like Strontian Dog and Slain and things to life. So there's various other things that I'm into that you go, cool, all right, yeah, it'd be nice to turn that. You could turn that maybe into a small skirmish tabletop game or something like that. But yeah, again, it'd be. I think I focus quite a bit on small scale, very quite story driven gaming a lot of the time, especially for my own stuff. Anyway,
what might people be surprised to hear that you're not very good at?
I'm terrible at collecting armies and finishing stuff. I'm such a butterfly gamer. And so I suppose people would be surprised that I haven't actually played Warhammer in like 10 years. I've played Age of Sigmar, actually. That's not true. I played Age of Sigmar. I didn't play Warhammer for quite a long time and came back to Age of Sigmar. But yeah, I've not actually, Warhammer, Age of Sigmar, I suppose, clears that a little bit. But I've not collected and painted a 40k army for pretty much since I left Games Workshop 16 years ago. There you go. So I played the various other smaller games and stuff, but I'm a terrible 40k player, I suppose you would say, because I've not really played at all, except once or twice with my ancient Eldar army, which the first models were from before second edition. So I'm despite everything I write about it and interact with it and stuff, I'm not really much of a 40k hobbyist anymore in terms of the battle game anyway. But that might change. I always keep looking at it, and I briefly was very interested in 8th edition when it came out, and I bought that, and I was going to do it with my son, and I started putting some together, and then got distracted and did some other stuff, and then the time had kind of gone, because again it was all very exciting and enthusiastic, and then I say I didn't quite ride the wave all the way into actually finishing that army. So I've got like about 5 Primaris put together and stuck some Death Guard together for him, and then that was it. So Whereas I'm much better at finishing some other stuff, funnily enough. I think it might be just because I do deal with it so much in my day job, writing and things, that maybe actually I want to change when I'm doing my toy soldiers. That might be part of it.
What have you recently changed your mind about?
I'm always changing my mind, I suppose, in some ways, in terms of I think it's kind of linked to one of the other questions as well, really. But I would say for a long time, and working at Games Workshop for years, and amongst sort of like incredible painters and artists and things. So it was always what was presented was the most aspirational version of what was, what's termed the Games Workshop hobby. So, beautifully painted miniatures over amazingly modelled battlefields. And that was always in my head as the goal. It was to try and recreate that for myself. But of course, not being a professional heavy metal painter, not being a professional design studio scenery maker, whatever, it's actually, it took a while, I think, for me to refocus and onto what I think I want to do and achieve and play and things like that for my own enjoyment, and to a level that I feel is acceptable, but actually not insane. So I guess, it's perfect. It's sort of like was fairly hammered into me. And again, as aspirational, of like, it's like, don't play with unpainted models. You don't play with sort of like proxies and things like that. And particularly because I am very big on the aesthetic of miniatures gaming. That's the point of using miniatures, is they look great, and if you've got like a tin can pretending to be a dreadnought or something like that, then it takes away from that aesthetic. I've never been necessarily like just purely focused on the game aspect of the games. So that I still have an element of that, but actually, particularly because I'm so bad at finishing stuff and then come to those realizations of like, no, you know what? It's okay to put some grey plastic on the table now and again. If you want to try something out and use something as something else, that's fine. So I've become less hardcore, I suppose, in terms of like what the perfect game is and what people should aspire to and do. Which means that I actually get to play a few more games and a few different things, because I don't have to have like a completely finished painted force to do this thing, or because it was preventing me actually enjoying stuff, because I wouldn't play until, like, say, I'd finished painting 20 models for that game or whatever, which meant I didn't get around to playing it, and people had moved on to something else, or I'd moved on to something else. So yeah, remembering the game part of gaming as well as the aesthetic side of it has been a bit of a journey for me.
When was the last time something in the hobby surprised you?
Not very often, I suppose, but actually people's models, people's enthusiasm continually surprises me. I just look at stuff and go, oh, that's really cool. I suppose surprised. The last thing I think for me was when I was a little while back now, but I was looking, I deliberately was looking outside, like sort of like the big games for other stuff. And particularly I was looking for fantasy and science fiction that wasn't kind of like the standard tropes and things that you see in lots of miniatures games and things like that. And I was pleasantly surprised by just actually how much other stuff's out there once you start looking, smaller companies, but also things that are genuinely quite original and different and aren't just like riffs on space troopers or fighting aliens or knights and medieval kind of fantasy and things like that. And again, I suppose it's part of that hobby journey, really, of moving away from what's right in front of you and actually delving into some of the slightly more obscure parts of the hobby and trying to find. For me, again, it's trying. We're all trying to recreate slightly the feeling we have when we started out. We're all harkening back to those days of discovery and things like that, I suppose, of like when we first came into the hobby and everything was very new and shiny, exciting. And for me, part of that was always like going into like a hobby store and nosing around the bargain blister box, and finding what was there, because, whereas these days, of course, everything is very marketed and generally in your face from lots and lots of different companies and things. So you don't necessarily have to go looking for stuff. So I deliberately try to surprise myself sometimes by looking in the unexpected places, going to war game shows and looking through the bring and buy or the, sort of like resellers and stuff to try and find something that's slightly old and obscure or whatever that I wouldn't have expected to find.
Tell me something that's true that almost nobody agrees with you on.
I still maintain it is possible to release and support a set of commercially successful war games rules that don't use army lists. And of any kind. Whereas actually, almost anyone else I talk to, whether publishing or game designing or whatever, there are sets of rules that don't use army lists and things like that. But actually, I have some ideas for a particular type of game system, which is essentially self-regulated. Now, I can't get to work, unfortunately, but I will get to work one day, which doesn't use army lists, doesn't use, even though we were talking about open combat earlier, again, that doesn't use army lists as such. But what became evident with that and trying to design a car with that is that, again, people still wanted more guide. They did want army lists. They wanted guidance, although it's a completely free form, create your own set of rules. The lack of structure just through people, So there's the people that get it and they really go for it, but actually there's a huge amount of people that just want that structure. They want to be told how to collect, how to structure things into their game and things, which is understandable. But I think, but I've got, I don't know if it's a third way and that I've been working on, which is sort of an all-encompassing scenario for selection games victory condition system that I will get to work, but haven't yet. And maybe that the convention of army lists in war games is so entrenched now, particularly for battle games. Not quite so much, but yeah, still versions of army lists, even for small skirmish games and things. Everything has points values, everything has to have balance. And I maintain that while that's true, I think it is possible to make like I say, the important bit is the commercially successful part, because there's lots of rule sets out there which don't necessarily treat collections and forces in the same way, but they're quite small, I would say, in scope and appeal compared to the big games. So I will prove that truth one day. When I finally get these rules finished at some point and published, and then they'll just flop and everyone will go, but where's the army list? And then I'll be proved wrong.
Maybe not.
But I've not been proved wrong. I've only been argued wrong so far.
Yeah.
Until it's done. Until I've proved, it's the test of the theory. The theory is that you need army lists to sell miniatures. Particularly, I will prove them wrong. But yeah, maybe I won't. We'll see.
If you're one of those kind-hearted people who tips their servers, taxi drivers and bar staff, how about tipping your favourite podcaster too? And if you've any money left after that, how about tipping me? If you appreciate the work that goes into putting this show together, or if this episode's simply helping you to pass the time whilst you work, drive or paint, then you could leave a little something by going to bedroombattlefields.com/tip. That's bedroombattlefields.com/TIP. And now, back to the show.
Tell me something you once believed about the hobby that turned out not to be true.
So before I joined Games Workshop, so I'd finished school, I was 18, I wasn't quite sure what to do. I wasn't going to college to become an artist anymore. That was going to turn out. So I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. And I had as only a naive, enthusiastic 18-year-old could ever conceive, I had the idea that I was going to open a war games shop. And I was looking through, I can't remember what war games, like Miniatures Wargaming or War Games Illustrated or something like that, and looking at all the adverts for the manufacturers in the back. And it's all very exciting. Because like I said, I'm into everything. It's like I love Romans, Napoleonics, Vikings, whatever. So I find everything all very exciting. So I had this idea of this Games Workshop professional style store, but with multiple stockists. And I thought, it's obvious it's going to work. That'd be amazing. And I'll just do that. And I'll just, people will flock to that. And it's like, no, that's not what that would, now, just knowing what I know about how people collect and buy and all the rest of it, it's just like, no, that store would be dead within months. Because I think, it's so broad and so, I think the closest you get to something that I was thinking of would be something like the War Games Foundry sort of thing, but with multiple stockists, multiple manufacturers and stuff like that, it just would be impractical. So there is no such thing as a one-stop hobby shop. I don't think it's too broad, it's too big. And as soon as you start, unless you're going to go for something big, unless you're someone like Games Workshop with your own stores, or you go, or you stock some of their stuff or the big things, people aren't, especially now, obviously this was pre-internet as well. These days it'd just be absolutely dead in the water with like people just, if they want miniatures, they're just going to order them online. They're not going to travel to the cool little historical war game shop down in Stevenage or wherever that I was going to set up. So yeah, I think that everyone's as enthusiastic about all the soldiers as I was when I was 18 is not true. People tend to, I realise how much, there are still quite a lot of people that like a lot of different games, but people tend to be far more focused on one or two very particular games or periods than I used to imagine, because I always loved everything. Whereas actually the number of people that are just 40k players or just Napoleonics players or just 6 mil players, you know what I mean? It's far more than I ever realised when I started out. I didn't realise people were quite so streamlined, as it were, I suppose. Again, that's changed slightly as things have broadened out, and again, particularly with the advent of lots more kind of smaller skirmish style games where you can kind of dip in and maybe collect 10, 20 models of a game system, play it for a little bit, put it to the side, try something out. Whereas actually, of course, again, this was back when everything was battle games, really. Everything was about collecting large armies, obviously, or whatever counted as a large army back in the early 90s. So yeah, whereas I think there's certainly more Battlefly gamers around these days of smaller games and things, but the traditional war games thing of collecting big armies and playing big battles, funny enough, takes a lot of effort, and actually people don't do necessarily. Most people don't necessarily spread themselves thinly. They find one or two games that they like and just play those. So yeah, that was the main thing I suppose I've discovered over the last 30 years.
Are there any common hobby myths and misconceptions that make you roll your eyes?
A few. I mean, I suppose it's sort of like a slightly adjacent hobby myth, I suppose, but the idea that somehow there's always this misconception that at Games Workshop, in particular for the Warhammer 40,000 setting, that somewhere there's a giant big book of everything that we just kind of look up stuff in and go, like there's some kind of hidden Bible that we don't let the public see, but it's all been worked out. And it's like, no, we're all just making up as we went along. It's like, it's not, that thing doesn't exist. In fact, actually, it's really hard trying to put it all together, back together now. So, it's far less organized than people thought, I suppose. But actually, I suppose, tying in a little bit to what I was saying earlier, I think and something that's become much more evident, like as social media and like Instagram and Facebook and things has expanded, is that that somehow you have to be good at your hobbies. That your hobbies should be fun. It's not, there's always, especially with gaming, obviously there's a bit of a competitive element in the games themselves and things, but actually you're not in competition with anyone else doing that hobby. I was thinking that if you collect coins, then I think there might be, there's a slightly, again, social media's one of the pillars of social media is essentially engineered jealousy. It's like, oh yeah, they've got, or they've got that particular coin or that particular stamp or whatever, I wish I had that in my collection, is a certain thing. But actually, or the size of the collection. But actually, particularly on the craft side of things, there was somebody, fairly recently shared something which was really good, which was just basically, you don't have to be good at, if you enjoy doing watercolors, you just enjoy doing watercolors, and you shouldn't compare yourself to somebody who's a professional watercolor painter, or people just like knitting, or people who like other hobbies and things, and so therefore, actually, we shouldn't be comparing. We shouldn't equate our enjoyment of our hobby with the quality of the hobby. There isn't qualities that isn't a thing. I'm not going to paint as well as lots of painters are. I'm not the tactician that many other people are. The size of my collection isn't necessarily as big as some other people. So I don't have to be in competition with those people. I don't have to compare myself to those people to enjoy it. And actually in doing so, we actually quite often, we put ourselves off. We put pressure on ourselves to try and conform, and particularly because again, the culture that we're in, this idea that we're supposed to, it's all well and good kind of getting better at a craft, practicing your painting, getting better, learning new techniques. All of that's important, but actually none of that's more important than just having fun and enjoying what you're doing, which again sort of comes back to my, it's okay to use plastic, and if that's what you want to do, and things are not trying to attain a standard that's impossible and therefore no longer fun. And how we don't have to professionalize our hobbies. It's going back to when I was painting miniatures when I was 11 or 12 and not caring particularly that, the fun of putting the paint on the miniatures was the fun of putting the paint on the miniatures. And they clearly weren't as good as the ones that are in the magazines and things like that. But it didn't matter to me then because I just enjoyed the process of it. And as you get older and you start aspiring to do better and things like that, you're in danger of losing some of that because actually you're never happy with what you've done. We're always hoping that you go, well, okay. So it's again, remembering it's a hobby. It's supposed to be fun. It's not supposed to be something that gives you stress. It's like it doesn't matter what somebody else has put on Facebook and how big their arm is, or what or how nicely painted it is compared to yours, because yours is your hobby. The doing of it was what was the point of it. It's not a competition with other hobbyists. And so and I think. That's quite important that people try and remember that, because it's very easy to get dragged into those kind of comparisons. And again, not deliberately by anybody else. And people should definitely share their miniatures and things. And again, there was sort of a commissioned painter who shared some stuff, and they were saying how it was weird because, of course, some people would reply to them and just go, "Oh God, I might as well just break my brushes now," because they could never. And it's like, and that made them feel bad for sharing stuff. And they're like, well, because they felt like that's a negative comment. Where, of course, it's meant as a compliment, but actually it's not, because you're telling people you're putting them off their hobby. It's like, well, they're not competing with, the people that are good at these things aren't, unless you're literally entering a painting competition or entering a tournament or something, they're not in competition with you. They're just enjoying the same hobby, and they just happen to have more time or a certain talent or aptitude for doing things differently. And you have to be happy with your own level. And I think one of the things I try to do, for example, on Twitter and stuff is like, because quite often you share nice miniatures, that's how social media works. But actually I try to go out of my way and share stuff that isn't necessarily the best, but is definitely somebody's labor of love, or do you know what I mean? It's like somebody who's just clearly enjoyed doing this thing, and it might be a bit of a ropey conversion, but it's cool. It's just like, it's a cool idea. They're having fun with it. It's one of again, going back to the Games Workshop thing, it was always the top tier aspirational stuff that was shown, and very rarely we managed to put, because, and I understand that sort of from the commercial point of view, that you want to show your miniatures at their best, and things like that. But actually, showing people a bit of, like easy terrain made out of a Pringles tube, rather than beautifully modelled, whatever, giving people some stepping stones, actually showing real armies, for people who painted it in 3-color and just like flock to base. That might not be the place for like a professional magazine like White Dwarf necessarily, but certainly the community can do, the community should celebrate the hobby as the hobby, and not just the most aspirational, the highest achieving parts of the hobby, I suppose. And we should be better at that.
Are there any particularly satisfying mechanics you've either created yourself or came across whilst playing someone else's game?
So my favourite mechanic is Blood Bowl, is when Jervis created the blocking dice for Blood Bowl. It's my favourite thing. It took a really complicated game with lots of sets of tables and looking things up and modifiers and stuff, and turned it into a really simple roll 1, 2, or 3 of these dice, and then depending on how you roll, something happens. And it was so streamlined and so simple, and made the game so much more playable. Yeah, it was just genius. It's just, so that's been one of my favourite mechanics, I think, of anything. And because it was a physical thing as well, it was the idea of, well, actually, we can do stuff with dice. They don't have to just be D6s. They don't have to have equal weighting between the 6 results. And actually rolling multiple dice and picking one, not necessarily having to add them all together or all that kind of stuff, was just, it made the game. That third edition Blood Bowl is just a beautiful piece of games engineering based around those very simple mechanics, and I loved it when it came out. It was like I loved playing it. In terms of mechanics myself, and it's one I've chatted with people before, I suppose, when I did Inquisitor, and people quite like. So Inquisitor, it's very narrative, and what you do is you nominate what your character's going to do, what you want them to do. You rather than having like a set of action points to spend and then you just go through and do them, you say, oh, well, they want to run over here, they're going to hide behind a barrel, and then they're going to shoot at that sort of like cultist over there. And then you roll a bunch of dice depending on their speed, and each 4+ actually allows you to have part of that action. So what you're doing is you're never quite sure exactly how much of your intended actions you get to actually resolve. So there's always a tension between trying to do stuff and playing it cautious, and people certainly have spoken to me and saying that, again, that's kind of quite core to the game, and that's one of the things that makes it quite fun is that, and it kind of, again, that played back into the Blood Bowl thing of the idea of the turnover, the idea of the failure. I think for me, narrative comes from unpredictability sometimes. Is the things we remember most about the games are the things that we didn't expect to happen. When your knights charge in and crush that goblin unit and run them down, you go, well, that's what they were supposed to do. Yeah. When the goblins charge in and crush the knights and run them down, that's a story. Yeah. At the same time, when your dwarf general flees, or the thing goes bad or well, particularly well, that's what we remember. And I think so that idea of when you with Inquisitor, that unpredictability of not quite knowing what your character was going to do, and that slight step back from having total control over them. So it's like, well, I want them to do this, but they might trip up, they might just stumble, they might just get there but not fire, they might just be caught in the open halfway there. Adds to the story of the game. So yeah, I'm quite pleased with that one as well. It's very simple, but it's actually a very effective way of adding some unpredictability into the gameplay.
Do you have any advice for those who want to follow your path?
Literally, the path that I follow doesn't exist anymore because of changes at sort of Games Workshop and the way things, happen now. So because, I was lucky enough, I got recruited by Games Workshop in the 1990s when they were expanding. They deliberately were getting more games designers in. I got very lucky. I got an interview and I started there. And I was there for 14 years during, the period of massive growth and things like that. But that's just not how their studio works now and things like that. And I also happened to be there when they set up a publishing company, Black Library, so I literally started writing fiction, that way. For a guy who was like 3 desks down on the left, sort of thing. So that again, oh yes, yeah, just all you need to do is be working at a company that sets up a publishing imprint and lets you write for them. That's easy. But the piece of advice I always give to people who want to do anything hobby related, whether it's game design, painting, or whatever it is like the reason I got the job, I think, and the reason I've done so well is it was what I was doing anyway. So when I was a teenager and I was into like gaming and reading and all that kind of stuff, fantasy and science fiction and things, comics. But I was writing scenarios, I was creating characters, I was coming up with little campaign ideas, I was designing games with my friends. Because I enjoyed doing them. Like I say, at that time, what I really wanted to do was I wanted to become an illustrator. Yeah, so I was looking at all the cool pictures in all of these books. And it's like, well, that's what I wanted to do. But it turned out I wasn't really good enough at art to do that. What apparently I was good at was actually coming up with characters, creating stories, writing games, so that's what I was doing anyway. And so particularly writing, when people sort of like, whether it's fiction or game rules, it's like, well, you want to be doing it anyway. If you choose to, it's a terrible career to choose, right? It's full of uncertainty. There's very few opportunities. It's like, you're much better off, studying accountancy or coding or, something that people will definitely need in the future. As much as it's still expanding, it's like there's more opportunities in games design and kind of writing and creative jobs than there's ever been in the past. But it's still a very small number of people actually get to make a career out of it. So what you need to do is just do it. I turned up to my interview with a big pile of stuff that I'd written and sketches that I'd done of things I'd invented, and I'd borrowed my mum's electric typewriter and typed stuff up so it was legible for rules for, like, I don't know, orc boss wagons in epic games, and all kinds of other stuff that I'd invented. So I was doing, it wasn't like I decided to do this for a job. It was something I enjoyed doing anyway. And I think that's how you have to approach it. It's not a vocation, you're not being a vicar or a nurse or something, but it's close. It's like that creativity has to be in you. You'd have to be wanting to do it even if nobody was paying you to do it, I suppose, is how I'd put it. And then look for the opportunities. And don't fixate on one particular thing. Again, so many people say, like, oh, how do you write for Black Library? How do you work for Games Workshop? And it's like, the chances are you're not. Because, within all those things I just said, you're now then narrowing all your opportunities down to one company. Like, you might be a really big fan of Warhammer. The chances of you actually getting to work on Warhammer are close to zero, in the same way that, you might be really into playing for, Man City or whatever. So your chances of actually playing for Man City, starting as an 8-year-old or whatever, are very slim. You might want to be a footballer. That's at least, like, broaden out at least that far. And if you're good, and not to compare it like in terms of quality, but just in terms of opportunities, like, you may end up in the Premiership. You may end up so it's that thing. It's like, be a writer. Don't be a writer of a particular thing. Be a games designer. I mean, games design, again, is very hard. I don't really have much of it in because, I worked for Games Workshop for many years, but actually my experience of working in this game design in the wider industry is quite limited. I've had commissions. People tend to ask me to write stuff for them. I don't write stuff speculatively and try to get it published. I've had a conversation quite a few times with other designers, which is like, well, I very much like to design games, but I'm not sure I really want to run a games company. But the problem is the people who do run games company have plenty of ideas for games already. So, it's like, actually be prepared to do some self-publishing, perhaps get some of those other skills. Again, I was very lucky. The training at Games Workshop, because we worked across and with all the departments, with miniature designers, with artists, with project managers, with production, with editors, I spent time on White Dwarf magazine doing layout and photography and things. So this gave me a very broad appreciation of how to make games and games articles and all that kind of stuff, which has proved invaluable, later in life. But actually picking up some of those skills, learning how to use a bit of, Adobe Illustrator, how to lay something out for yourself, whatever that might be. Because then if you're enjoying doing it, if you're creating a game or creating a book, and then actually you've given yourself, there are more means to publish stuff now than there's ever been in terms of digital publishing and print on demand and accessibility, more so than, ever before. So if you equip yourself with the skills, you've got as much chance of getting something out as anyone did. If you fixate on, I want to do X for Y, that's my job. It's cool. You can work towards that and that can maybe be a thing. But actually, it's the same as just saying, well, I want to write Batman. You go, very lucky if you do. That's a career goal, but that's not a career. Yeah. And I think that's the difference. It's like, it's get some experience of it, do it, and then maybe you get to pivot it into a career that people pay you for or you earn some money with. But actually trying to set out to do it is very hard. Just from the get-go is earning money. No, it's not going to happen.
And finally, what are you working on right now? And is there anything else you'd like to share with the listener?
The main thing is I have been working with former GW alumni Andy Chambers on a game called Xeogenesis, which is for a company called Best Hobby, which is about big mech fighting suits, sort of very anime influenced. We've taken that to a couple of shows now. We'll take that to Adepticon and the UK Games Expo. There will probably be, it's going to be, the range is fully injection molded plastics. They're going to be done in-house by Best Hobby, based on art from Dan Morrison, who's a concept artist, and be looking to see more of that by the end of the year, really. There will be a Kickstarter, mainly just to promote it towards the end of the year. It's not like it needs funding or anything like that, but actually, these days Kickstarter is a marketing tool as much as anything. That's been a lot of fun. That's been about a year and a half of my life. Very recently, I was working on the script for the new Age of Sigmar video game, Realms of Ruin, which again was a great project to work on. And it's nice to see everything come together. You send words off, but actually seeing cinematics coming back and all the motion capture done and all the rest, and those words have turned into things. So there's that. I've just delivered, I can't say what it's about, I've just delivered another novel, my first novel in a year, just over a year, for Black Library. So that'll be out at some point over the next 18 months, I guess. Yeah, that's it really. That's the stuff I've mostly been working on that I can talk about. There's a couple of other projects which are just kind of starting, which I will probably be sharing a bit more about in the months to come, but not quite in a position to say yet. I have a Patreon if people want to subscribe to that, which is basically $1 a month. And occasionally I remember to put something up there, just like Q&As, interviews, random bits of games that I'm working on, some short stories, all that kind of stuff. So people can always find out what I'm up to there as well. That's Gav Thorpe Create on Patreon.
Thanks very much for listening to this episode of the Tabletop Miniature Hobby Podcast. If you enjoy the show, then please do share it with someone else you think might enjoy it too. And be sure to check out our Discord community of like-minded hobbyists, which you could find at bedroombattlefields.com/Discord. It'd be great to see you in there.